The engineer's burden. The mind behind the FAMAS. The late afternoon sun filtered through the grimy windows of the Saint-Étienne arsenal, casting long shadows across the cluttered workbench where Paul Telly bent over blueprints that would challenge everything the French military thought they knew about rifle design. In his calloused hands, he held the first prototype of what would become the FAMAS, a weapon so unconventional that senior officers would dismiss it as backwards nonsense until battlefield reality forced them to reconsider everything they believed about infantry warfare. The year was 1967, and France faced a crisis of military identity. The humiliation of Indochina still burned in the collective memory of the French army, where outdated rifles and obsolete tactics had proven catastrophically inadequate against guerrilla fighters armed with modern Soviet weapons. NATO standardization pressures mounted, while French pride demanded technological independence. In the research halls of Manufacture d'Armes de Saint-Étienne, engineers struggled to bridge the gap between tradition and innovation, between what generals wanted and what soldiers actually needed. Paul Telly understood this tension better than most. The prototype felt wrong in his hands, too compact, too strange, its action positioned behind the trigger in a way that violated 3 centuries of military convention. Yet every calculation on his desk proved its superiority. The smell of machine oil and metal shavings filled the workshop as he adjusted the trigger mechanism for the 100th time. Each modification bringing him closer to a truth that would haunt him for decades. Creating better weapons meant creating more efficient ways to take lives. Monsieur Telly, Colonel Marchant requests your presence in the briefing room, a young orderly announced from the doorway, his voice echoing in the cavernous workshop. Telly set down his tools carefully, the weight of responsibility already settling on his shoulders. He had spent 15 years at the arsenal, but never had a project felt so personal, so dangerous. The FAMAS represented more than engineering innovation. It embodied France's desperate attempt to prove technological independence in a world increasingly dominated by American and Soviet military designs. Born in 1923 to a family of Alsatian metalworkers, Telly had watched his father's precision tools requisitioned by German occupiers, had seen French industry humbled and stripped. Young Telly's mechanical aptitude emerged early. By age 12, he could disassemble and rebuild any clockwork mechanism in their village. The war interrupted his formal education, but resistance work taught him improvisation skills no engineering school could provide. In hidden workshops, he learned to create function from fragments, to make reliability from salvaged parts. Walking through the arsenal's corridors, past displays of rifles that had served France through 2 world wars, Telly reflected on the cruel irony of his profession. Every weapon he perfected would eventually find its way into the hands of young men who would carry it into places where precision and reliability meant the difference between coming home or not. The FAMAS, if successful, would arm French soldiers for decades to come. Colonel Henri Marchant waited in the briefing room, surrounded by charts showing performance data from recent trials. His weathered face bore the marks of a man who had seen too many promising designs fail when they mattered most. Your Bullpup performed admirably in controlled conditions, Telly, but I have concerns about field maintenance. How does a soldier clean the action when it's positioned behind his trigger hand? The design prioritizes compactness for urban warfare and helicopter operations, sir. Maintenance procedures will require adjustment, but the tactical advantages don't matter if the weapon jams in combat because a conscript can't properly service it, Marchant interrupted. The generals are asking hard questions about this project. Telly had heard these objections before. Military conservatism ran deep, rooted in the reasonable fear that innovation might cost lives if it failed. Yet he also knew the cost of stagnation. Reports from Algeria and Indochina painted a clear picture. French forces needed weapons suited for modern combat, not museum pieces designed for 19th-century battlefields. The meeting lasted 2 hours, covering technical specifications, production timelines, and the political pressure to deliver results. As Telly returned to his workshop, darkness had fallen over Saint-Étienne. The industrial city hummed with the sounds of factories working late shifts, feeding France's economic recovery. Inside the arsenal, security guards made their rounds, while engineers like Telly worked through the night, driven by an obsession that their families struggled to understand. If stories like this make you question what you'd do in someone else's boots, tell us in the comments how you imagine you'd react in this camp, and stay with us for the next chapters. How does a man measure the worth of his life's work when that work exists to end other lives? After the liberation, Telly pursued weapons engineering with the quiet intensity of someone who understood that mechanical precision could mean the difference between freedom and subjugation. He joined the Saint-Étienne arsenal in 1952, initially working on conventional rifle improvements. But Telly harbored a radical vision. What if the fundamental architecture of military rifles was wrong? What if compactness and balance mattered more than traditional aesthetics? The Bullpup concept wasn't new. British and Belgian engineers had experimented with placing the action behind the trigger group to shorten overall length while maintaining barrel length. But every attempt had failed due to complexity, cost, or military conservatism. French ordnance officers viewed Bullpup designs as engineering curiosities, impractical for mass production and field maintenance. When Telly first proposed his unconventional rifle concept, Colonel Henri Marchant, head of small arms development, reportedly laughed. "Monsieur Telly, soldiers have carried rifles the same way for 3 centuries. Do you really think you're smarter than history?" The challenge stung because it contained an uncomfortable truth. Telly wasn't just questioning rifle design, he was questioning the accumulated wisdom of generations of military men who had fought and died with conventional weapons. Yet the mathematical evidence was undeniable. In the cramped confines of armored vehicles, in the narrow corridors of urban buildings, traditional rifles became liabilities rather than assets. But Telly possessed something his critics lacked: an obsessive understanding of infantry combat realities. He spent countless hours interviewing veterans from Indochina and Algeria, learning how traditional rifles performed or failed in jungle fighting, urban warfare, and helicopter-borne operations. Soldiers complained about length and weight, about weapons that caught on vegetation or proved unwieldy in confined spaces. They needed compactness without sacrificing accuracy, reliability without complexity. These conversations haunted Telly's evenings. Sergeant Michel Rousseau, who had served 3 tours in Algeria, described the frustration of clearing buildings with a rifle designed for open battlefield combat. "In Algiers, monsieur, we fought in spaces no bigger than your workshop. Every corner was a potential ambush, every doorway a choke point. Our MAS-36 rifles were excellent weapons, but they belonged to another kind of war." Each interview added weight to Telly's conviction that military thinking lagged dangerously behind tactical reality. Modern warfare demanded new tools, even if those tools challenged everything the military establishment believed about proper weapons design. Working primarily alone, often during off hours, Telly began crafting what would become the fusil d'assaut de la manufacture d'armes de Saint-Étienne. His breakthrough came not through revolutionary technology, but through obsessive attention to ergonomics and manufacturing efficiency. The Bullpup configuration allowed a full-length barrel in a compact package, while innovative materials reduced weight. Most importantly, Telly designed the weapon for French industrial capabilities, using production techniques that could be implemented without massive retooling. The work consumed him. His wife, Marie, watched with growing concern as her husband disappeared into his obsession, returning home each night covered in metal shavings and machine oil, his mind still wrestling with mechanical problems that had no easy solutions. "Paul, you're designing this weapon as if you'll be the one carrying it into battle," she observed one evening as he sketched trigger mechanisms at the kitchen table. "Perhaps I am," he replied quietly. "Every engineer puts something of himself into his creation. This rifle will carry my name, my reputation, my responsibility for every life it touches." The weight of that responsibility grew heavier as the FAMAS took shape. Unlike academic engineering projects, weapons development carried moral implications that kept Telly awake at night. He was creating something designed to kill efficiently, and no amount of technical elegance could change that fundamental purpose. Yet France needed this weapon. The defeat in Indochina had exposed the inadequacy of French military equipment against modern adversaries. NATO standardization pressures threatened to make France dependent on foreign weapons designs. The FAMAS represented technological independence, a proof that French engineering could compete with the world's best. Dr. Henri Laborde, the arsenal's chief metallurgist, often found Telly in the workshop long after official hours, refining components with the dedication of a craftsman creating art rather than instruments of war. "You know, Paul, in another age you would have been designing cathedral clocks or precision timepieces. Instead, you're perfecting the machinery of conflict." "Perhaps that's what our age demands," Telly replied, examining a trigger spring under magnification. "We live in a time when the alternative to superior weapons is national humiliation." The contradiction ate at him daily. He was motivated by patriotism and professional pride, yet creating something whose success would be measured in battlefield efficiency. The FAMAS would either vindicate his vision or condemn it, and either outcome would bear his name forever. Can a man serve both his conscience and his country when they demand different sacrifices? The first prototype tests in 1971 created unexpected controversy. The FAMAS demonstrated superior accuracy and maneuverability compared to conventional rifles, but its unusual appearance triggered resistance from traditionalist officers. General Claude Vincent famously declared the Bullpup an embarrassment to French military heritage. Critics argued that soldiers would never adapt to the unconventional layout, that maintenance would prove impossible under field conditions. The testing facility at Sattery buzzed with tension as senior officers observed the FAMAS trials. Telly watched from the observation booth as professional soldiers put his creation through its paces, his heart racing with each shot fired. The weapon's performance exceeded specifications in every measurable category, yet the faces around him remained skeptical. "It looks like a clarinet attached to a pistol grip," muttered General Vincent to his aide, loud enough for others to hear. "What will our allies think when they see French soldiers carrying such contraptions?" Telly bit his tongue, knowing that defending his design too aggressively would only reinforce perceptions that he was an obsessive engineer out of touch with military realities. The FAMAS had to speak for itself through performance, not rhetoric. Captain Laurent Dubois, selected to lead the test team, approached the firing line with visible reluctance. A veteran of Algeria with strong opinions about military tradition, Dubois embodied the institutional resistance Telly faced. Yet professionalism demanded that he conduct fair trials. "The balance point feels wrong," Dubois reported after his first magazine. 60 years of muscle memory tells me where the action should be. This will require complete retraining." "How did it shoot?" asked Colonel Marchant. "Accurately," Dubois admitted with obvious reluctance. "The compact dimensions make target acquisition faster, especially in confined spaces. But accuracy means nothing if soldiers can't maintain their weapons in field conditions." The trials continued for 6 weeks, testing the FAMAS in various environments and scenarios. Each day brought new criticisms, alongside grudging acknowledgements of the weapon's capabilities. Telly documented every complaint, every suggestion, preparing modifications that would address legitimate concerns without compromising the design's fundamental advantages. Meanwhile, letters from home carried news that complicated Telly's single-minded focus. His brother Claude, an electrical engineer in Lyon, wrote about the changing political climate in France as student protests and labor strikes challenged traditional authority. "The old certainties are crumbling, Paul. Your generation understood the necessity of sacrifice, but these young people question everything, even the need for national defense. What happens to weapons like yours in a world that may not want them?" The question haunted Telly as he refined the FAMAS design. France was changing and military institutions struggled to adapt. The rifle represented technological progress, but progress toward what? A stronger France capable of defending its interests, or simply more efficient tools for conflicts that diplomacy should prevent? Telly faced a career-threatening moment when initial military trials produced mixed results. The prototype's trigger mechanism proved less refined than conventional designs, and extraction issues emerged during rapid-fire tests. Ordnance officials prepared to cancel the project, but Telly requested 6 months for modifications. 6 months to save a project that has already consumed 4 years and substantial resources, Colonel Marchant stated flatly. The ministry expects results, not promises. "Sir, every revolutionary design requires refinement. The problems are solvable with proper attention to metallurgy and manufacturing tolerances. Revolutionary designs also require revolutionary results to justify their existence. You have 6 months to prove this weapon's worth, or the project terminates." The ultimatum sent Telly into a frenzy of 18-hour workdays. He refined the action, improved the trigger group, and solved the extraction problems through metallurgical adjustments that demonstrated his deep understanding of materials science. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford. Marie brought meals to the workshop when he forgot to come home for dinner. Dr. Laborde watched with growing concern as Telly pushed himself toward exhaustion. "Paul, you're treating this project as if the fate of France depends on its success." "Perhaps it does," Telly replied, examining firing pin springs under magnification. "Military independence requires technological independence. If we cannot produce superior weapons, we become dependent on those who can." The moral complexity of his situation intensified as news from Southeast Asia highlighted the human cost of military technology. American forces in Vietnam carried weapons designed by engineers like himself, men who solved mechanical problems without seeing the faces of those who would use or face their creations. Each innovation in weaponry represented human ingenuity applied to humanity's oldest and most tragic pursuit. Do you think you'd cling to what you were taught back home, or to what your own eyes see in a place like this? Comment which side you'd lean toward, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history. What price does a nation's pride exact from the men who forge its tools of war? Working through the winter of 1972, Telly discovered that technical problems often masked deeper philosophical questions. Each modification to the FAMAS forced him to confront the relationship between innovation and tradition, between individual vision and institutional wisdom. The rifle embodied his engineering skills, but also his assumptions about France's place in the modern world. The workshop became his refuge from a world that seemed increasingly complicated. Student demonstrations in Paris challenged traditional authority, while economic pressures forced difficult choices about military spending. The FAMAS project existed within this turbulent context, representing both technological progress and stubborn adherence to the idea that national strength required superior weapons. Dr. Elizabeth Moreau, a psychologist contracted to study soldier adaptation to new weapons systems, began visiting the arsenal regularly. Her research examined how military personnel adjusted to radical changes in equipment design, but her conversations with Telly revealed deeper questions about the psychology of creation. "You speak about this rifle as if it were alive," she observed during one of their sessions. as if it has agency beyond your engineering decisions. Perhaps it does, Telly replied. Once released into the world, any creation takes on a life of its own. The FAMAS will exist long after I'm gone, serving purposes I never intended. Does that trouble you? It should, Telly admitted. But the alternative is worse. If French soldiers carry inferior weapons, they pay with their lives for our technological failures. The second round of trials in 1973 transformed skeptics into believers. Special Forces units testing the improved FAMAS reported unprecedented performance in close-quarters scenarios. The weapon's balance point made rapid target acquisition easier, while its compact dimensions proved invaluable in vehicle operations and urban environments. When French paratroopers in Djibouti successfully used prototype FAMAS rifles during border skirmishes, battlefield reports silenced most remaining critics. Captain Dubois, now leading the evaluation team, submitted reports that vindicated years of Telly's work. The FAMAS exceeded performance specifications while proving surprisingly adaptable to field conditions. Soldiers initially resistant to the unconventional design learned to appreciate its tactical advantages. "I was wrong about this weapon," Dubois confided to Telly after the trials. "My prejudices against innovation nearly cost us a significant advancement. The rifle performs exactly as you promised, yet success brought unexpected burdens. Military officials who had dismissed the FAMAS now claimed credit for supporting its development. Politicians spoke of French technological superiority, while engineers like Telly remained anonymous figures whose contributions went unrecognized. The weapon's approaching adoption meant that thousands of young men would soon carry his creation into situations where its performance might determine their survival. Telly's correspondence with Marie revealed his growing ambivalence about success. She had moved to stay with her sister in Bordeaux while he completed the project, unable to compete with his obsessive dedication to the FAMAS. "Success should feel better than this, Paul. You've achieved everything you set out to accomplish, yet you seem more troubled now than when the project faced cancellation. What kind of victory leaves the victor so conflicted?" Her letter arrived as Telly prepared final production specifications. The FAMAS would soon transition from prototype to standard French military issue, a transformation that represented both professional triumph and moral complexity. He had created something that would outlive him, serve purposes he couldn't control, and bear his technical signature on countless battlefields. Father Jean-Marie Blanchard, the arsenal's chaplain, often found Telly in the workshop during evening hours, wrestling with questions that had no engineering solutions. "You're troubled by the disconnect between intention and consequence," the priest observed. "You designed this weapon to protect French lives, but weapons don't distinguish between aggression and defense. How does one live with that contradiction? By accepting responsibility without claiming control over outcomes beyond your influence. You created the best possible tool for its intended purpose. Others will determine how that tool is used." The philosophical comfort offered little practical relief. Telly understood that the FAMAS represented his most significant professional achievement, yet that achievement was measured in military effectiveness rather than human welfare. The rifle's success would be calculated in tactical advantages and battlefield performance, not in the broader question of whether superior weapons made the world more or less safe. But Telly's vindication carried unexpected weight. The FAMAS became not just a successful weapon, but a symbol of French technological independence during a period when European militaries increasingly adopted American equipment. The rifle's distinctive appearance, derided as clarinet by early critics, became a source of national pride. French arms exports expanded as other nations sought similar Bullpup technologies. How long can a man carry the weight of creating something designed to outlast him? The personal cost to Telly was considerable. Years of obsessive work had strained his marriage and damaged his health. Success brought recognition, but also responsibility for a weapon that would arm French soldiers for decades. In interviews late in his career, he spoke thoughtfully about the moral complexity of creating instruments of war, about the engineer's burden of seeing his innovations used in conflicts he never intended. The revelation came unexpectedly in the spring of 1975, during a visit to the military academy at Saint-Cyr. Telly had been invited to lecture about weapons development to officer candidates, a recognition that should have felt like triumph. Instead, standing before rows of young men who would someday carry weapons he designed, he experienced a profound moment of moral clarity. Engineering is often presented as a purely technical discipline, he told the cadets. We solve problems through mathematics and physics, as if human consequences were merely additional variables in our calculations. But weapons engineering forces us to confront the reality that our technical decisions have moral implications we cannot escape. During the question period, a young lieutenant asked about the FAMAS's anticipated service life. 40 years, perhaps 50, Telly replied. Long enough for some of you to carry it into retirement, and for your sons to inherit it from your armories. The weight of that timeline settled over him as he spoke. The FAMAS would outlive him, serving in conflicts he couldn't imagine, shaped by geopolitical forces he couldn't predict. His engineering decisions would echo through decades of military service, touching lives yet unborn. A classified report arrived at the arsenal that summer, documenting early combat use of FAMAS prototypes by French special forces. The technical performance exceeded all expectations, but the human testimonies revealed complexities Telly hadn't anticipated. Soldiers praised the rifle's effectiveness while struggling with the psychological impact of wielding superior firepower. Sergeant Mark Beaumont wrote from Chad, "The FAMAS gives us tactical advantages that save lives, but superior weapons create moral burdens. When you know your equipment outclasses the enemy's, every engagement becomes a test of restraint as much as tactical skill." Then the report contained a disturbing revelation. Arms dealers were already approaching foreign governments about licensing FAMAS technology. The rifle Telly designed to serve French national interests would soon become a global commodity, sold to any buyer with sufficient funds. His creation was escaping the moral framework within which he had justified its development. Dr. Moreau returned to interview Telly about the psychological impact of seeing his design achieve operational success. Their conversation revealed the depths of his internal conflict. "You've achieved everything an engineer could hope for," she observed. "Your weapon performs flawlessly, serves its intended purpose, and brings honor to French military technology. Yet you seem burdened rather than celebratory." "Because I understand now what I chose not to see during development," Telly replied. "I focused on technical challenges while ignoring moral implications. The FAMAS will serve causes I oppose, protect regimes I despise, and enable conflicts I deplore. Could you have designed it differently to prevent such misuse? No. Once a weapon exists, it becomes available to anyone with the power to acquire it. I created something that cannot be uncreated, cannot be limited to noble purposes." The conversation haunted Telly for months afterward. He'd entered weapons engineering, believing that superior tools in the hands of democratic nations would promote global stability. The reality proved more complex. Technological advancement in military affairs often accelerated conflict rather than preventing it. Marie visited Saint-Étienne that autumn, their first meeting in nearly 2 years. The distance between them had grown beyond geography into fundamental differences about the meaning of his work. "You speak about this rifle as if it were a curse rather than an achievement," she said during dinner at their old favorite restaurant. "Thousands of engineers would envy your success." "Success at what cost?" Telly asked. "I've created something that will outlive me, serve purposes I oppose, and bear my technical signature on battlefields I'll never see." "Then why continue? Why not request transfer to civilian engineering projects?" The question struck at the heart of his dilemma. He could abandon weapons development, but the FAMAS would continue without him. His moral withdrawal wouldn't eliminate the weapon's existence or limit its proliferation. He was bound to his creation by responsibility rather than choice. The FAMAS entered full production in 1978, becoming the standard rifle of French armed forces until 2017. Its influence extended far beyond France, inspiring Bullpup development programs worldwide and proving that unconventional thinking could challenge centuries of small arms tradition. Telly's gamble on the Bullpup future had succeeded, but success brought its own complications. Standing in the production facility as the first mass-produced FAMAS rifles rolled off assembly lines, Telly felt the complex satisfaction of completed work. His vision had become reality, transforming from blueprints into tools that would serve France for decades. Yet the moment carried profound melancholy for dreams that success had destroyed. What does a man owe to the world when his greatest achievement becomes its burden to carry? In the end, Paul Telly's legacy transcended the weapon itself. He had demonstrated that innovation required not just technical skill, but the courage to challenge established doctrine, the persistence to overcome institutional resistance, and the vision to see possibilities others dismissed. The mind behind the weapon had changed more than military technology. He had changed how armies thought about the relationship between form and function, between tradition and necessity. The final twist in Telly's story came in 1989, during the fall of the Berlin Wall. Television images showed East German border guards laying down their weapons as civilians celebrated freedom. Among the discarded equipment, Telly recognized FAMAS rifles, exported to Warsaw Pact nations through complex arms deals that made mockery of the democratic ideals he thought he was serving. "So this is how engineering serves peace," he observed to Dr. Moreau during their last recorded interview. "By creating tools that dictatorships use to oppress their people, then abandon when popular, will prove stronger than military force." The irony was complete. His weapon, designed to protect French democracy, had been used to suppress freedom elsewhere. Yet even this revelation carried complexity rather than simple condemnation. The same FAMAS rifles abandoned by authoritarian guards were later acquired by liberation movements fighting for democratic ideals. Marie returned to Saint-Étienne in 1991, after Telly's retirement from the arsenal. Their reunion was tentative, marked by years of separation and fundamental disagreements about his work. Yet they found common ground in the recognition that his achievements and sacrifices belonged to a specific moment in history that was ending. "The world is changing, Paul. Perhaps your generation's understanding of necessary evils will seem quaint to our grandchildren. Perhaps. But each generation faces choices between idealism and pragmatism. I chose pragmatism and lived with the consequences." Telly spent his final years documenting the FAMAS development process, creating technical archives that would inform future engineers while warning them about the moral complexities of weapons design. His memoir, published posthumously, became required reading at military academies worldwide. The most revealing passage addressed young engineers contemplating careers in defense technology. "You will be told that superior weapons promote peace through strength, that technological advantage prevents conflicts by deterring aggression. These arguments contain enough truth to seduce brilliant minds into rationalized cooperation with violence. My advice is simpler. If you choose this path, choose it honestly, accepting that your skills will serve causes both noble and ignoble, that your creations will outlive your intentions and exceed your control." A second revelation emerged from Telly's private papers, discovered after his death in 2003. He had quietly donated the proceeds from FAMAS licensing fees to refugee organizations, attempting to balance the weapon's destructive potential with humanitarian assistance. The gesture was modest compared to the rifle's global impact, but it represented his effort to accept responsibility for consequences beyond his control. Father Blanchard, now elderly, conducted Telly's funeral service at Saint-Étienne Cathedral. The ceremony drew engineers, military officials, and politicians who praised his contributions to French military technology. Yet the most moving tribute came from an unexpected source, a letter from Sergeant Beaumont, now a colonel, who had carried the FAMAS through 20 years of military service. Monsieur Telly created a tool that saved my life and the lives of my soldiers on countless occasions. He gave us advantages that brought us home safely to our families. That his invention was also used for purposes he deplored doesn't diminish the good it accomplished in our hands. Every technology reflects the moral choices of those who wield it, not those who create it. The letter suggested a different interpretation of Telly's legacy, that moral responsibility for technology belongs primarily to its users rather than its creators. Yet Telly himself rejected this comfortable absolution, insisting that engineers bear permanent responsibility for the potential applications of their innovations. The FAMAS remained in French military service until 2017, when it was replaced by more modern designs. Its 4-decade service life validated Telly's engineering vision while confirming his moral concerns about creating durable instruments of warfare. The rifle influenced military technology worldwide, inspiring bullpup designs that became standard in many armies. Today, museums display the FAMAS alongside explanatory text that mentions Paul Telly's revolutionary design philosophy. Visitors learn about ballistics and manufacturing techniques, but rarely about the moral struggles of the man whose vision became metal and wood. The technical achievement overshadowed the human story, as Telly himself predicted. In his final diary entry, discovered among his papers, Telly reflected on the relationship between intention and consequence. "I created the FAMAS to serve French democracy and protect French lives. It succeeded in those purposes, while also serving causes I opposed and threatening lives I valued. This contradiction defined my career and will define my memory." Perhaps that is the fate of all who choose to shape the world through technology, to discover that the world shapes their creations in return, often in ways that challenge their fundamental beliefs about purpose and responsibility. Day. The late afternoon sun filters through different windows now, casting shadows across museum displays where the FAMAS rests behind glass. Visitors examine its compact design and revolutionary configuration, appreciating the engineering elegance that Paul Telly achieved through years of obsessive refinement. Few consider the moral weight that rested on the shoulders of the man who proved that even the most humanitarian intentions can produce consequences that outlive their creator's dreams. If this story reminded you that even in the darkest times, small acts of humanity still matter, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story. What burden does history place on those whose genius serves both creation and destruction?